everyone, and thank you for being here with our webinar today. Our panel discussion is how can data make employees feel safe? Awesome. A few admin notes today. Because of the large number of people on the webinar, we've muted the participants' audio line. We welcome questions during the presentation. Please use the chat feature or raise your hand. We'll do our best to accommodate you. We have saved some time for discussion at the end of the webinar if you'd like to save your questions. Diversity Works created the DEI Leader Network because we found that the role of the DEI professional can be very lonely in many organizations. I know it happened to me when I was working in a lot of organizations. Unless you're lucky enough to have a team, DEI leaders often shoulder an enormous responsibility on a challenging topic. This network is intended to give DEI leaders a community to lean on and learn from. Next slide. And just to tell you again, we are a woman-owned firm. We evaluate organizations' DEI performance. We use data-driven approach. We believe that effective DEI strategies are grounded in business drivers and that you make gains on both when your DEI strategy is aligned with your business strategy. Our approach seeks to understand the organization so we can build the strategic facet that you need to help ensure it's sustainable for long-term success. So today we have a great panel and I am excited. We have our co-founder, which is Holly Wittenberg. And Holly brings 20 years of experience in management consulting, entrepreneurship, venture capital, and merger experience. She provides data analytics expertise to deliver meaningful and actionable insight to all her clients. We call her all things data. She's our data guru. Jakub is the director of partnership development at ICYMI. And we really like what Jakub has to say today. And he's going to talk about the software aspect of it, how to become anonymous and what you need to do with your clients and within your staff too. Jakub has worked with HR departments for the past 14 years. This includes global deployment with some of the most influential and data sensitive organizations. He focuses on helping speak up cultures. And psychological safety has a lot to do about speaking up, making sure that everyone gets a voice at the table, not just coming to the table but feeling safe. Nicole Crowley is a human resource consultant who works with business leaders to align their people's strategy with their business goals. Nicole spent more than 20 years of her career leading HR teams for high growth, progressive companies with a focus on talent acquisition and development. Nicole is passionate about the stories behind data and working with her clients to use data and make it meaningful. We will have Nicole jump in at when she sees it's necessary and tell us really what's really going on inside the workings of the HR departments. And she's a consultant. She'll reveal what she can reveal and keeping it psychologically safe. Next slide, please.
Great. Thank you, Denise.
Go ahead, Holly.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Holly Wittenberg. Thank you for the kind introduction, Denise. They let me out of my data cave every once in a while to talk to humans, which I always appreciate. Diversity Works is built on the foundation that DEI improves business performance and that performance drops to the bottom line. But what we have done is we have developed a series of assessments that we think are critical to start on the right foot. A lot of organizations launch a DEI effort with a list of tasks, update the policy and procedure manual, conduct unconscious bias training. But if you haven't conducted an assessment, that's typically where we want to start with you. Research tells us that there's no question that DEI efforts improve business performance, but we think that it's really through a strategy, not through a set of tactics, that you're able to capture that value. So with that, I will turn it over to Jakub to talk a little bit about ICYMI.
Yes, Jakub, tell us about how ICYMI can help, the tools that ICYMI has that can help with psychological safety.
For sure. Well, ultimately, ICYMI as an organization, we've been working with HR, employee relations, and compliance departments for the past 22 years, arming them with a solution to enable a better way to ultimately track and manage their complaints allegations, and investigations. So within ICYT, we offer organizations multiple different ways to submit concerns, complaints, or allegation through a multi-channel approach, then a consistent approach to ultimately track and manage the complaints or allegations with, at the end of the day, ultimately auditability and defensibility built into your process. So having a process in place is only the first step. Being able to follow that process and, more importantly, prove that you are consistently following that process is a second piece of the puzzle. And then the third pillar, which is really the focus of today's topic, is the reporting. And that's giving our clients the ability to use the data that's collected throughout this process to ultimately learn more about their organization, what's going on and what's lying beneath the surface. Is there more to stories? Are there risks? Are they systematic or isolated? And using and training organizations to use a more data-centric approach to combating issues and misconduct. And then having a consistent workflow and access controls that will govern that entire process. And if we switch to the next slide, just to summarize kind of the key business impacts, and today we'll focus on data security and data-driven decisions. And that's ultimately what we're trying to arm you with is, well, we think there's something there, but it's more effective to ultimately use data to see, is there something there, and to prove that there needs to be something from a policy change to an organizational cultural change.
So Jacob, so what's hampering psychological safety? You talk about this software that's helpful. How can the employee feel safe and think that they're going to be safe by providing that information to you, to the software, and to your company?
Well, from a starting point, it's giving them multiple different avenues depending on their comfort to be able to submit an allegation or complaint. So that's kind of step one, is notifying, depending if you have an issue, we'd like to hear it. We're giving you multiple different channels, from going to your HR business practitioner, going to an online form to submit it, submitting an email, or ultimately telling someone so that it can funnel its way into the ICYT system. And then that's kind of the first stepping stone. From there, it goes to the ability to prove that you have a process in place. So employees need to know that if I'm going to submit a complaint, what's going to happen with it? Is it just going to go into a box and no one's going to look at it, so there's no point of complaining? Or is there that investigative process that's documented behind it? They follow it consistently. And then the last part of it is about the resolution or the communication of that resolution. If they're going to take a corrective action, is it consistent? Should I be worried that potentially this is a high-performing employee that I'm complaining against, or a senior executive, as they don't have a historical track record of consistent corrective actions? And so that's ultimately what the tool provides, is the validation behind the intents of most HR, employee relations, and compliance departments, is to serve their employees and improve their culture within organizations.
Great. So do you see any barriers regarding this process?
So typically, yes. Right from, as an example, the first approach of funneling it in, is there a source to be able to submit an allegation? If I choose to be anonymous, does the organization enable anonymous reporting? Will my anonymous reporting be respected, or is there a chance of retaliation? And so ultimately, that's where it starts from, is that speak up culture. Once employees feel safe that they can speak up and that their complaints, their allegations will be heard, they're more likely to submit their complaint or allegation. So really, to hamper on it, it starts there, is organizations need to have a speak up culture, because the more complaints that they receive, the more allegations they receive, the more data they ultimately have, and to see, is there something there? Is this a systematic risk that we should address before it escalates to potentially a full-blown scandal?
Great. Holly, I want to make sure that when we get into the next phase about psychological safety, that Nicole, would you give us the definition, next slide, please, of what psychological safety really means?
Yeah, so psychological safety sort of takes the idea of trust, but at the group level. So you may trust each individual around the table, but psychological safety comes when you are thinking through the process and you trust that each of those individuals understands the process to get to the right outcome. So ultimately, you believe that you are not going to be punished or humiliated, that that the process is going to take care of you, and therefore you feel safe disclosing information that might be sensitive.
Exactly. Based on what Jacob is saying, you have to have that feeling also within the team, within the group, and talk a little bit more about the individual versus the group process regarding psychological safety. Sometimes people think like, okay, I may feel individually that I'm psychologically safe, but is it? So tell us the distinction.
I'll give a very explicit example, but I may trust each of the individuals around a table, and I may believe that each individual has my best interest at heart. However, processes break down. So for example, each individual, I may come to the table, let's say with a sexual harassment complaint, and I may trust that each of those individuals thinks highly of me and believes me, but a process step breaks down and the person in charge of the investigation forgets to tell the person being investigated about our non-retaliation policy. And that process breakdown then leads to potential retaliation or even conversation that makes that person then feel unsafe. So psychological safety then starts to fall apart. I feel like I trust each individual around the table, but the process in which the investigation has occurred has failed me, and therefore I no longer feel psychologically safe.
Awesome. And as we get to it, is what Nicole has just said, psychological safety is not that nothing's gone wrong. It's that it's okay if something's gone wrong. It's the absence of the fear of the negative consequences that's important. And so it goes hand in hand together with what Nicole is alluding to. And Holly, why don't you take us through the stages of psychological safety?
Oh, absolutely. I just want to echo what Jacob and Nicole said. You know, when I used to manage a team of operations back office associates, we used to talk about operations failures every week. And we always started the meeting reminding each other it was about process, not about people. People don't wake up in the morning saying, I'm going to do a really crappy job today. The process fails them. So you want to build in redundancy. You want to build in systems, whether it's software, whether it's, backups. It can all be manual. It can all be paper. You can still design a really rigorous process, even with very few inexpensive tools. The fortunate thing is we have some great options now, like Jacob software. So this is a continuum of safety, and it's pretty self-explanatory, but, when you think about where your organization is along this continuum, these are some of the cues you can use. So inclusion safety is you just feel safe as a member of the team. A learner safety is you feel safe to ask questions, right? So there's no stupid questions. You're encouraged to ask questions to do the best job possible. Contributor safety is, as it implies, that you are secure enough that you're able to actually offer up ideas for, let's say, safety improvements, right? That's a really clear area where literally psychological safety can improve physical safety and improve the bottom line if you have a safety problem in your organization. And then challenger safety is really the pinnacle where an individual feels like they can push back on an idea or on a change in the organization and won't suffer embarrassment, harassment, consequences, that's all really encouraged. So really the North Star that everybody should be directing themselves towards is that challenger safety.
Okay, now we have a poll for you. And would you go on and put that next, please, our technical person? And the poll.
There we go.
Okay, great. So which action would most improve the feeling of psychological safety? If you would just jot that down and we will submit it as soon as possible.
Give them, ooh, people are answering. I love it. I'd like to see the numbers go up. Give them another minute or two, another 30 seconds maybe.
Mm-hmm.
43 respondents so far. Well, this is good. You guys have picked the thing that I think is our next point on our next slide. That's very helpful, audience.
Go ahead. All right. If you would put that up for me so I can see it, Scott. Wow. The biggest contender is better communication from leadership. Wow.
And then zero tolerance for harassment.
Yes. Awesome. Awesome. So what do you all, could you all comment on that? Is that what you all thought would be the answer for this team, this group?
Nicole, you want to go first?
I think absolutely I believe better communication from leadership, because communication, typically, if you believe that communication and people put their money where their mouth is, I would think you'd want to see communication and action, but I understood that piece. And I was the zero tolerance, again, many organizations have zero tolerance, but we don't always see the actions that support that zero tolerance. So I would add, I would not be surprised by these answers if we saw action as it related to these two statements.
Great point. Jacob, any thoughts?
Jacob, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Ultimately, when individuals within an organization see a consistent communication from leadership, that there is zero tolerance for harassment, discrimination, or other misconduct, they'll feel more safe that, it wasn't that one time a year we heard it from the executives because they have to tell us. It's a more consistent messaging that aligns with the culture that they're trying to shape here within the respective organization. So really, both of those go hand in hand for me.
Awesome, great, good. Holly, you have any comments you want to add?
I would just say I agree completely. I think, like I said, on the next slide or two, we'll be talking about these very issues, so we can.
Awesome. Next slide, please. And so we want to ask you, Holly, what's the connection between data and psychological safety, since you do most of the data work for us at Diversity Works, and where that is the main crux of what we do. We want to make sure that we are justifying the decisions that we make, the recommendation that we make, that we have some type of data to substantiate that.
That's right. And on the next slide, what I want to do is walk you through this framework of that at its center is about a culture of action and transparency, right? So that's really what we're talking about. We're saying not only are you collecting this data, analyzing it, acting on it, and sharing it, but that is only really important if it's done correctly. So in a culture of action and transparency, you communicate not only what is good, but what is bad. And for the stuff that needs improvement, you show how you're going to act to remedy it. And so, again, back to the story about process, not people, if you show that there aren't negative consequences for people who come forward and, that challenger level of safety, who say, we keep making the same mistake, we need to do it differently, that person isn't disciplined, that person isn't fired, but maybe even promoted, then you're creating a culture of action and transparency. So let's walk through each of these. We titled this webinar to be a little, not provocative. It's too boring probably to be considered provocative, but it's not really intuitive why data and psychological safety would go hand in hand. And the idea about data is that then you make data driven decisions, right? So you're not making gut decisions. To Nicole's point, it's not one individual's feeling about a department or about a manager's ability to manage a group well. It's about the data that you're collecting. So data per se doesn't drive psychological safety, but the connection is through this rubric, collecting different types of data, analyzing the data, and all of this requires, a methodology, a process, acting on that data. That's that rigor that we were talking about, that every piece gets sorted through, and either sometimes no action is action, right? But that the important things are acted on and resolved. And then last but not least is sharing the results. Now, sometimes it's not appropriate to be specific. We were working with one of our clients, and they got feedback through the workplace culture assessment that we did with them, that they didn't think the firm did enough to recruit people from underrepresented groups. And it turned out they were doing a lot, but they hadn't told anybody what they were doing. They hadn't been successful, but they were working hard at it. And so that's a great example of sharing what you're trying to do. Now, they weren't able to say how many applicants they had or where it was in the process, because it was too small of a sample size, and they wanted to maintain privacy, but they were able to at least communicate in general what their commitment was to it and what they were trying to accomplish. So with this, with this model, we think that you can reinforce a culture of action and transparency, and that, in essence, is the link between data and psychological safety.
Awesome. So what kind of data should we be collecting when you're talking about psychological data, psychological safety?
If you go on to
Next slide, please.
2 more slides. Yep. Great. And I think this is a good place for Jakub and Nicole to also weigh in. So we know a lot of organizations have a minimum set of data that they have to require just to be compliant. But we really believe that a whole host of data can actually improve your business performance and reinforce this sense of psychological safety. Again, if it's a customer satisfaction issue and you're focusing on why the customer was upset and not necessarily blaming the last person that spoke to the customer, but really trying to understand the entire customer experience and the root cause, that's a great example of a non-traditional area where you might actually be able to improve psychological safety. And then again, something like pay equity, right? So being able to collect that data, analyze it, if you're committed to improving pay equity in your organization, and then reporting back on the progress that you're making in that area. But why don't I start with Jakub and ask him to talk? I know his work largely sits on the required elements, but I'd like to give him an opportunity to talk about this as well.
This is definitely an interesting one for us. I wouldn't be surprised if attendees are looking at these lists and saying, yeah, I can check off a lot of those. We do track that. But what we found is the challenge is that you may track it, but it's siloed. Yeah, we have a system in place to manage workplace violence or physical security or slips and falls. Yeah, we have a system in place to track and manage EEO issues or complaints and allegations, but there's no single source of truth to be able to judge or be able to ultimately gauge the level of psychological safety or the performance of your organization on that spectrum. And so what we find with our clients is often when they deploy our solution, once they start seeing the value that the reporting brings within their respective HR department or their employee relations department, they see, wow, that data, what if we incorporate our compliance data within it, or potentially our physical security data? Because what you'll find is that even from a starting point of the investigative data or investigation itself, I should say, is that a lot of times the actors involved in an issue are involved in issues elsewhere within the organization. Oh, this person has had a lot of complaints made against them because they've been rude to customers. And then in the HR department, they have a separate set of data that's telling them this employee is apparently getting reports that they're rude to their peers. And if you're able to marry those together, you're able to catch those trends sooner, again, before they escalate. So ultimately for us, that's where we work with organizations to break down those barriers and silos, because you might say, "No, we're pretty open." But then when we break in and we start asking those questions, well, HR department, do you ever see what compliance is doing? Like, do you know if there's any cases potentially involved with your individual over there? The answer is traditionally no. And so for us, it's working on a platform approach where we can manage all this within one system. If we can't, well, what if we pull the data over? Well, demographic data, that's sitting within your HRIS system. Why don't we bring that information over to supplement the data you have within your allegations and investigations to ultimately see, are there risky areas or concerns that you need to address, and then take a more data-centric approach saying, yes, here's a trend. Over the past 2 years, we've seen a growing issue of this type of concern within this department, and be able to back it up with data.
Awesome. Nicole, do you have any more information you'd like to add based on your experience that you're working with right now?
Yes, I'll add that, looking at some of those that must report on data, that's a great starting point. And when I talk about, and what I try to do with clients is work through, well, let's really unearth what the story behind that data might be, because data usually has various paths that are contributing to it. And so a good example is a company was hiring sales executives, and they were the primary reason when we looked at the recruiting data why interviewers were declining candidates was because they did not have strong communication skills. They did not like how they presented in the interview. And so we stopped for a moment because it was causing a problem in terms of pipeline and recruiting. And we looked at what was the number one reason why we were actually terminating sales executives when they did not work out at the company. And surprise, surprise, communication had nothing to do with why we terminated people. We were terminating people because they didn't have the organization skills. They weren't able to follow through. They weren't able to stay on top of their pipeline. And so this allowed the company to really take a step back and say, hey, let's revamp those competencies that we're looking at through the interview process, and let's test and see if we can actually train on communication. Most people, if you review a script with them 10 times, they are going to get better. And so it turned out that hypothesis was correct, that we could start to look at communication a little bit differently, think about if we could plan and train. And suddenly we saw termination rates go down. I should say involuntary termination rates go down.
Right.
So that's an example of sort of thinking through how powerful data can be and coming to really strategic and smart business decisions.
Great, Nicole, because I hear people say data could be fixed, data could be changed to fit the situation. So that was a great example. Did you have something to say, Holly?
Yeah, I just want to follow on. And the link to psychological safety is if you have a group where the termination rate is high, who isn't sitting feeling like they're under intense scrutiny? So having right people in the right job and having them be successful in that job is just good all around. And it won't make everybody feel like it's just a matter of time before they're on the chopping block. So that's a great example, Nicole. Thank you.
We have a question I'd like to ask any one of the experts, and Nicole, I think that might be something you want to answer. And Jacob, with demographics data collection system, how are you seeing voluntary LGBTQ plus demographics identifications being added into the HR system and vendor platforms? Have any of you have seen this? How are they adding the data collection from the particular groups I just mentioned?
I have seen it added as an option within organizations that value it and want to track it. So the short answer is yes, I've seen it as an option that's been added in terms of looking at demographics at that level. Not all organizations, and I would say many that I work with, are not distinctly looking at that vertical, is that the right word yet? But I also have a number that are.
Great.
And I think some of the advice that we give is it depends on the size of your organization, right? So if you've got fewer than 50 employees, including that may feel too targeted and may make people feel very vulnerable. So it also depends on that. And that's something we advise our clients on, and also how to ask the question. In one case, we just simply, we had a very simple option. And then if the person wanted to identify, that was a follow-on question, but it was really directed by the employee whether they wanted to, how much detail they wanted to provide. But size is important. And that's again about safety of knowing whether or not something private might be revealed inadvertently.
Yeah, so from
Jacob,
my perspective, we're seeing that data a little bit. So again, it's just an emerging trend within the HRIS system tracking. The rate of it actually being tracked, we find, is being tied to the region. So in certain states, it's a more common than in others. So we're still not seeing widespread adoption of that and being able to reliably use the data from the HRIS system for being able to track that. Where we're seeing clients pull in and be able to display the data is from surveys. So anonymous surveys that they send out, that's where they can judge the data and be able to have a larger response rate to be able to see and judge. So it's still, again, something relatively new where organizations are looking to track it. The comfort level to submit it, especially depending on the industry and region, varies. But ultimately, where we're seeing clients pull that data from are surveys. So your employee surveys that you send out can include these types of questions. Again, especially if they're anonymous surveys, the response rate is typically higher, which can be an indicator in terms of the comfort level of employees in the first place. But it is something that we are seeing organizations start to track, but more we're seeing that they want to track it and they're starting to incorporate it into the upcoming surveys. So hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll be able to have more data to be able to trend and baseline.
I also wanted to just add in one thing about, as we're talking about employee engagement, that employee engagement, many of us as HR professionals, it's, oh no, because it's that one big survey every year and you spend hours going through the data and cutting it 10 different ways to, again, figure out what is that story telling us. But employee engagement can also be measured in smaller ways, and for those of you who have engaged in, many call it pulsing the organization, but asking one question randomly in the middle of the week that people respond to, having lunch groups with executives, those are all forms of data too, that come to the table where many times that's where you actually start to get your story behind the larger employee engagement data that we spend hours trying to understand. So I just wanted to bring that up too, in light of Jacob's comments regarding employee engagement, that it doesn't all have to be about that one point in time during the big survey.
And Nicole, let me ask you one question. This is something that was posed by one of our participants regarding leadership and the zero tolerance. What's been identified is that there's no follow through on that. With that, and you talk about psychological safety. Would you comment on that? How that correlates to not the follow through, so leadership can understand that. That's the message that's being sent.
So how I actually counsel, and I'm actually in the midst of a big employee investigation right now, but I start by defining the process of what they can expect when, and I make sure that the leaders are adhering to those timelines that I've sent. But, zero tolerance, again, if it's only lip service, it doesn't necessarily matter anymore, because you need to actually, and the best example of this that I ever saw, it was a smaller organization where I had two founders who, quite frankly, were not, everyone is scared about litigation, right? And so sometimes we are so fearful of litigation that we forget who we are protecting. And we err on the side of protecting the individual who is going to have the consequence, perhaps of termination for his or her actions. And we forget about the protection of our team that is still in seat. And these leaders decided to err on the side of protecting their team that was still in seat. And as a part of that, very respectfully, they transparently walked through what they knew, what this team knew, what they knew had happened, and the consequence, what they decided to do. And I think they did it well in the sense that they were trying to protect, they were trying to protect how people were feeling in the room that day. They weren't trying to protect the person who had violated their policies. And they decided that they were going to take the risk that this person would come back and say, you didn't share things that were accurate. But they did so in such a respectful way without going into too much detail, that those leaders, people came to me and said, I've never seen something handled so well. They appreciated the transparency. So that is putting that is paying lip service. That is putting your money where your mouth is and taking that risk and not being fearful of litigation. Period. I'm not sure that answered the question, but it's an example of an organization that I think did pay lip service to their zero tolerance policy.
Well, and that's a good example because at least we can see what we should and should not be doing. And that's just the awareness piece is so important. As you said, you have to see it and understand the impact and the behavior and what that creates to kind of make a change. As we move on, would you like to add to that, Jacob? As far as regarding the software aspect of that?
I think, Jacob, if we move to the process slide, that's a great place for you to talk about the features that can help bring rigor to that process, if you don't mind.
But we'll go to the next slide, please. Next one.
Great. And Jacob, this is where you and I can talk about this together. Let me start by orienting you to this somewhat, perhaps intimidating slide. But if you remember, we've got the culture of action and transparency. We're collecting data, sharing data, analyzing it, acting on it, and that feedback, which is also data back in. And really what we want you to realize here, and this is Gartner's framework, and I really liked it because although it may not be completely intuitive, anybody can start with the data collection and this process. It's just a question of how much automation do you want? And the automation removes a lot of the process risk, right? Because if you build in automation, the process is more reliable typically. But I'll just orient you to the framework here and then ask Jacob to speak specifically about it. So here at the top, you've got what I would call low investment and low complexity. You've got data and you just have someone who's describing what's happening. You're looking at the data and the majority of the work is human input and trying to make sense of it to drive at a decision and an action. The diagnostic is the next level where you might be able to do, even something in Excel where you're counting the number of times something happens and trying to understand why it happened. And again, to drive a decision and action. Predictive is, we hear a lot about predictive analysis these days. And so, let's take the case of a single manager that gets a lot of complaints. You could probably guess that without some action that there might be more complaints and that you need to do something about it. And then this, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Jacob, is really the world of eyesight down here, the prescriptive, what should I do? So with that, I will, and again, this is the continuum of low investment, low complexity to high investment and high complexity. So Jacob, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so ultimately, it starts at the top and works down, and organizations have to start somewhere. So when we look at it, first, let's have a speak up culture. We want to hear what's going on. Tell us what happened. So now you're starting data analysis in terms of what's going on within the organization. But that's only the starting point. The next level you want to transition to pretty quickly is, why did it happen? And that's where organizations go from, this is what happened and this is what we did as a result of it, to start incorporating root cause analysis and metrics around that into their investigative process. So why did it happen? What was the root cause? When we look at it, was it lack of training? Was it individual misconduct? What was it, an other element? And that gives you a data set now that from a starting point can start to grow to transition to the next one. Well, what will happen? And that might be at an individual case level, communicating what will happen during the course of the investigation, and according to your process and policies, communicating to the appropriate stakeholders what will happen and what did happen consistently and clearly. But at an aggregate level, in terms of the data, it becomes, once we have what happened and why did it happen, we can start using that information to be able to see trends. So we have got a client, a civil rights office for a large transportation agency, that they were able to use the data and specifically the root cause to identify teams or units that were most at risk of a specific misconduct category that they were targeting. And then that's where they transitioned to the next step as a remediation and preventative action. They targeted those groups with training. So instead of going out and training everybody, they've got a limited training budget. They want to use it wisely. And they went to those groups. And so now what did they do? They provided training. And then subsequently to that, they're able to use the data over time to show the effectiveness of their training. So this is where, when you start tracking all these elements, what happened, why did it happen, what could happen, or what should we do? That's where now you can have that continuous improvement model built into your mandate and your structure, where I can go and say, this is why we should be providing training here and there. This is the effectiveness of that training. And that's, again, going back to one of my original messages, where it's about teaching organizations like HR and Employee Relations Department that historically have not had to rely on data as much as they do today, in terms of how you can use the data that you're collecting throughout your investigative process to be able to show ultimately your return on investment. So what are we doing to improve the psychological safety within our organizations? How are we actively preventing things like litigation and risk, or more importantly, employee turnover? So there's a large cost investment made with that. And if we can show that through our investigations, through a consistent approach, through clear communication of our process, we can have a direct impact on the bottom line of the functioning of the organization, it really improves that standing of employee relations and HR departments within their respective organizations.
Awesome, Jacob. This drives performance. And we're talking about a culture of action and transparency. You're looking at a movement of a culture within an organization that most organizations are looking for right now. And that's one of the things that we do when we look at the HR, we look at the decision-making process, the predictive process. Like, you can't prescribe before you really analyze. And this is what I'm hearing right here, to make the decisions. So the data does work if you follow it and you understand it and you're able to manage that culture.
Correct. Yeah. If we look at culture, one of the things that really hurts culture is word of mouth amongst colleagues. So if the average employee probably hasn't submitted a complaint, but they might be thinking about it, and then they hear a colleague, I submitted a complaint, I never got back, or, I submitted a complaint, they never did anything, or inconsistent corrective actions. And that goes back to really wanting to have consistency amongst your messaging, but more importantly, also your corrective actions. So what's going to happen if I complain against a high performing sales executive? Are they going to take it seriously and be consistent in terms of the resolution that they're saying, so zero tolerance? Or because they're a high performing sales executive, they're going to be able to get away with it. So that's where, if you're using data, that's the other thing, is you'll find consistency amongst the corrective actions that you're dispositioning. And that's something interesting that we start working with organizations. They say, yeah, we've got a policy. We're pretty consistent in applying, our corrective actions or recommendations of corrective actions across the board. But when they start looking at the data, they see, no, we're really not. It might vary across region, team member, the person that's recommending the corrective action, or the department that the ultimate subject was involved with. And so data doesn't lie. So you can use that data to see if what you're saying is actually true, and hopefully use it to be able to take a step in the right direction.
And I like what Nicole had said earlier about the pulse of the organization. Sometimes you don't have to take a big survey, but however, you know exactly what's going on. You're seeing the pulse to really try to create that culture of psychological safety. It's not a one time, it's a continuum. As we look at this on the Gardner analytics, it's a great piece to really look at your own organization. We have people coming to us and say, well, we want to do bias training. We want to do this training. And we're like, okay, let's take a step back. Let's look to see what the issues really are. What do we want to focus on? It's not that we're saying that it's untrue what you're saying. We just want to make sure that you have the data and the support so that you could have that psychological safety factor at every level of your organization. Would you like to add any comment to that, Nicole?
I was going to add, where I find that many of my clients get stuck is in the predictive category of what will happen. Either they feel like they don't have the right data, the amount of data, or the data analysis skills. They don't have their own Holly to confidently say that something will happen. And so sometimes how we reframe it is predictive is what could happen. And you start to have various stories under what could happen. And it becomes much easier to be prescriptive and to come up with decision support and automation systems to help address those could scenarios versus will happen. And there's more comfort in that with many of my clients.
I think the last comment that I'll make, and before we finish the slide, is just you don't have to be a big company. You don't have to invest millions of dollars in infrastructure. That's one of the points I'd like people to take away from this, is even just collecting the data and reading it, even if you don't have strong analytical skills, and really trying to analyze it in some sort of cohesive way to drive at your decision making is a great first step. Now, there are solutions that are as little as $50 a month for up to 300 employees for anonymous reporting systems. If we're continue to talk about investigative processes and infrastructure, all the way to ICYMI, where Jakub and his team works with a whole range of company sizes, but even the largest in the world, 10,000 plus employees. So don't be afraid of data. Data is your friend. I'm just kidding. I'm not really kidding. And Diversity Works is here to help. Nicole is here to help. Jakub is here to help. We'd all love to work with you on helping you make more data-driven decisions.
Awesome. Next slide is going to be our question and answer. If we haven't answered any questions that you may have, so please do so at this time. If you want to, we'll take you off mute now. Or you want to put your message, your questions in the chat.
Or if you just want to weigh in on it with a story or share your experience, we'd love that.
Okay, awesome. So what I've been hearing today is really the need for data. Data helps with decision making, the predictive analysis, and it's also for risk management, as Jakub alluded to with the software process. And it does not cost a lot. I heard Holly said that it can cost you very little to really get the facts to substantiate whatever it is the individuals are feeling in your organization. We hear about the barriers to psychological safety. And we hear it's actually, based on what Nicole said, it's a perceived lack of knowledge at times, that authoritarian leadership aspect. You're not allowing the group or the team to express themselves too. That's and it's experienced at the group level. It's not just the individual level. If you're talking about the individual, that's something different. Then we talk about psychological safety. And, so how do you create safety? Make sure you're promoting the self-awareness, you're soliciting questions within the team and the group, and you value what people are saying in the organization, and you take a look at yourself internally and see how you can better the group. Any other comments by the team, by our experts here?
No.
Okay, great. So we'll go on next slide. We'll tell you about our next session, which is going to be in January. And we want to wish everyone a happy holiday.
Yeah.
The next session is going to be on talent management with Queenie Platter. we're looking forward to that, and we wish everyone just a great time during the holiday. And if you want to have any more questions about ROI, if Jacob or anybody else wants to say something about that, that's great. But if not, I will see you next time.